Today we finish up August 1988 and move into September. Couple notable things this time around. We are going to be introduced to one of the longest running Japanese RPG series. We've also got a couple sports games, and only one military strategy game. Also, Konami and Pony Canyon totally dominate this episode with 3 games each. Almost half the games today are from those two companies. Alright, let's get rolling. Once again, we're going to start off with one of the big games this episode. Naturally, it's a Konami game, Mad City. No idea what that name is supposed to mean. The viewers will more likely know this under the Western release title, The Adventures of Bayou Billy. Got a fancy new title screen and even some speech samples. However, Adventures of Bayou Billy is one of the most hated Konami NES games for a good reason. It's just too damned hard. We'll discuss that in just a moment. First, let's note that Konami clearly modeled the protagonist on Paul Hogan's Crocodile Dundee character. If you weren't around in the 80s, you might not realize just how goddamn popular the Crocodile Dundee movies actually were. First movie made over $300 million, which is about what the Twilight movies make nowadays in today's money. You can really see the resemblance there in Billy's death scene. Like I said, most everyone hates this game, so we're actually going to be playing the original Japanese version, which has been translated into English. The game was changed up quite a bit for the US release, mostly by making it considerably more difficult. Even weak enemies take way too many hits to kill, and it seems that the food and weapons are more common in the Japanese version. While still a difficult game, it's more playable than Bayou Billy. You may have noticed the "My God" dialogue blew in a moment ago. I guess this may have been written by the same guy who wrote I Senshi Nicole. So anyway, Mad City starts off as a techno-style beat-em-up, in which your character can move from the front to the screen or the back of the screen by pressing up or down. You need to be lined up vertically with your opponent in order to actually hit them, especially when using the knives or the gun. Billy can perform a punch, kick, or a jumping kick. You can also pick up weapons, which, hooray, are usable until the end of the level. They don't disappear after a few moments like in so many other beat-em-ups. Between levels, you get those cute little intermission screens where the bad guy taunts you with your tied-up girlfriend in the background. These, of course, can be found later in many other beat-em-ups as well. Now, here's the weird thing about Bayou Billy. It's mostly a beat-em-up, but Konami threw in a few light gun levels and driving levels sort of mix it up a bit. The light gun levels are okay, I guess. I find them to be sort of tedious. You can use a light gun or a D-pad, depending on which game option you choose in the main menu. Unfortunately, the D-pad makes it a bit more difficult. This helicopter boss, though, I guess, is pretty cool looking. Now, the driving segments really don't work that well. Your object is simply to beat the timer while avoiding getting killed by other vehicles and this old-fashioned looking bomb-dropping parasol wing aircraft, which makes me wonder, what time period is this game supposed to take place in anyway? Though for some unknown reason, Billy has a machine gun mounted to his Jeep which you can use to shoot the other cars, and also toss sticks of dynamite at the planes. Then you reach New Orleans. You fight your way down Bourbon Street, you get the best weapon of the game, the whip, which is very useful for taking down enemies without getting too close to them. Then you get to the second light guns section. Here I think I'm actually using the D-pad. It's really hard to control. The crosshairs move across the screen really quickly, so it's difficult to aim precisely. There is a certain amount of luck required in this level. Enemies will randomly drop health refills or ammo, but if they don't drop any extra ammo, you can run out. I did die a couple times playing this due to lack of ammo. Then you get the toughest and most infuriating bosses in the entire game, especially the little guy who throws knives that are really hard to hit. This game can get a little tricky in places. Fortunately, you'll pick up some extra lives along the way, and if you make it to the last boss with the whip and the bulletproof jacket, you're pretty much good to go. Facing against the final boss in his luxuriously decorated mansion eventually became sort of a cliche in beat-em-ups, but it was still pretty fresh here. He does move pretty quickly for such a fat guy. And then the last boss, once again with the whip and some patience, you can defeat these guys, whoever they're supposed to be, no problem. Now here's a sort of a cool thing left out of the US version, I believe. There are multiple endings depending on what you do at the very end. When you're reunited with your kidnapped girlfriend and do nothing special, you get the standard happy ending. And just like Castlevania, there's also like a mock credit sequence at the end. Billy's full name is given as, unfortunately, Billy West, so nowadays he shares the name with the prolific cartoon voice actor. The game does share a few things with Konami's Castlevania games, like the whip looks just like Belmont's whip, the multiple endings is similar to Castlevania 2, the music is fantastic, definitely the funkiest music we've heard on the NES so far. Now here's the second ending. You need to hold down select and up when Annabelle hugs you. The dialogue is different, but it's still a happy ending. I'd say where Mad City fails is that the driving and shooting parts don't really seem fully developed and function more sort of as filler, and the US version's even worse because all the enemies take way too long to kill. It takes forever to kill a screen full of guys. It does seem sort of a bit like filler to me. Oh yeah, and here's the bad ending. You need to avoid letting Annabelle touch you, just walking around in circles, and then you get the sad ending. And there's actually another ending if you play the practice rounds before you start the main game. There's also a pretty worthless quiz section as well. So, my final opinion, the US version is too tedious and unbalanced. The Japanese game is pretty fun, though it certainly falls below such Konami classics as Castlevania or Contra. Still, I'd recommend if you want to play Konami's first ever beat-em-up before they perfected the formula a few years later, go ahead and give it a shot, especially the Japanese version. So, Konami's exciting sports series is dead, and in its place is this virtually identical series of sports games, all of which say Konamiku in the title. This is clearly a pun on Dyna'mix or dynamic, so Konamiko is a portmanteau of sorts between Konami and dynamic. This is usually transliterated as Konamic, so we're going to be calling this one Konamic Tennis. I believe the Japanese Blades of Steel was actually the first game to use this title, though I didn't notice the Konamic in the name when I covered that game. Anyway, you have your usual options, tournament, single game, you choose your team. Everything looks pretty much like every other FDS sports game we've seen so far. This is actually the fourth tennis game for the Famicom, I believe. Nintendo, Bandai, and Jaleco all had tennis games. The main innovation here is the animation of your character when you're serving the ball. As always, serving, by the way, is very finicky. There's a very brief window to hit the ball as it's coming down. Otherwise, you'll either hit the net or go out of bounds. When playing on the near side of the screen, you need to press the button right when the ball touches the service line. You have two types of swings. They seem to result in a fast, low ball or a high, slower ball. The high swing causes a really goofy sound effect. There's also an exciting mode in which a second person inserts his copy of the game and you can play against his team. The fact that it's actually called exciting mode makes me wonder if Konami was still confused over the name switch from exciting to dynamic. Other than that, it appears to be just a regular old tennis game. Okay, here we have one from Irem. A reasonably good-looking intro starts the game off here. You may have noted the developer's name was Tamtax. They should have changed that name if you ask me, but they were some sort of internal development division within Irem. So, Hototogisu, I'll be up front. This is yet another Sengoku-era strategy game. So basically we're looking at Nobunaga's Ambition Part 6. Probably the most interesting thing to most viewers is the very cool opening sequence, which makes medieval Japanese warfare look like it was straight out of an anime or something like that. Music's pretty good too. Yeah, like I was saying, definitely not a bad intro. Though one thing that puzzles me is the name. Hototogisu is the Japanese name for a kind of cuckoo. What this bird has anything to do with samurai warfare is beyond me. Interesting, there's a samurai sword in Final Fantasy XI called the Hototogisu. Maybe a cuckoo is considered to be sort of a badass bird in Japan. Well, anyway, is this game any different than all the others? Maybe. I guess it's a bit more complicated and supposedly historically realistic than some of the other games. It's always to choose your daimyo. There are about 40 choices altogether. You know, then it's collect taxes, engage in diplomacy and warfare, and so on. Supposedly this has a decent reputation in Japan. In fact, Irem released a sequel on the PSP not that long ago, though the game is somehow mixes in collectible cards into the strategy genre. As you might know, collectible card arcade games became pretty popular in Japan a few years back. I really was not able to get deep into this game. Here I foolishly start a fight before building up my army. It's a bad move. But if you absolutely must see more Hototogisu, there's actually a 33-part Let's Play on YouTube. As for me, I'll just summarize. Once again, it does appear to be a pretty good-looking military strategy type game. Well, here's an unusual situation. Last episode, Chrontendo episode 34, had an Eggerland game from HAL. Now today we have another one, except instead of being on a cart, it's on disc. Or rather, the disc writer. Last one came out August 9th, and this one's on August 20th, so 2 Eggerland games in a 2-week period. Like I said, that's a bit unusual. And this new one is a totally different game from the last one. It has, interestingly enough, an animated intro, something missing in the last game. I thought Lolo was always trying to rescue his girlfriend in these games, but she doesn't seem to be very kidnapped and actually waits for him outside the castle. Also, the structure of the game has been changed. The previous 2 took place in a maze-like castle, with each room interconnected with other rooms through a series of doors. Often a room would have more than one door, so you not only had to figure out how to get the key in each room, but also how to make your way through the castle in the maze-like layout. Here, there are no doors. Everything is strictly linear. After getting a key, you simply move on to the next level. This new game is also much shorter than usual. I think it's only around 50 levels, and it's also noticeably easier than the last few Eggerland games. On a positive note, this one does have the construction mode missing from the last game, which makes sense considering the Famicom Disk System's ability to save your data. So in other words, this is sort of like a budget version of Eggerland. It was never released in boxed form, you actually had to get it by taking a blank disc to a disc writer machine. So it would have been much cheaper, sort of like the 80s Japanese equivalent of the PlayStation Network or an Xbox arcade game. Alright, another title from Coconuts Japan and the mysterious Sea Dream. You might remember these guys from that weird pachinko game where you control a living pachinko ball who likes to play pachinko. So wait a sec, what's with the mahjong stuff in a pinball game? Well, the goal of Super Pinball is to obtain the missing mahjong piece as seen in the introduction. So you're playing pinball in order to complete your mahjong hand. Yes, I know that makes literally no sense whatsoever. Now remember that Nintendo pinball game from Chrontendo episode 1? Well, this is sort of a pumped up version of that. Actually has kind of like an automotive theme going on. There are 2 main screens, just like pinball. The Nintendo pinball, if your ball drops down to the bottom of the top screen, we're on the top screen here, it'll end up in the bottom screen. And there are various ways to earn points, such as lighting up the 4 buttons at the very top of the top screen, or going down the shop ramp. But just like Nintendo's pinball, there are some harder to find screens. There are 6 altogether that I know of, and I've gone through the trouble of reaching all 6 of these for this video. The ramp on the very left will take you back to the top screen, but eventually you can use it to get to the very top screen, this one right here, which can also be reached via a very hard to hit ramp on the regular top screen. Knocking down those figures in the upper left will earn you quite a few points. Then we have the UFO screen. I'm not even really sure how I even got here, to tell you the truth. Then we have the screen with the brain at the top. If you hit one of the beam buttons, it'll fire a laser and blow up the robots. If you get the ball in the very, very top, where the brain is, you'll get to the highest screen, which I think is called Complete Crush. According to a walkthrough, either destroying the robots and then hitting the brain, or knocking out all the blocks on Complete Crush will reveal the Mahjong tile, which is of course the point of the game. Also, when you lose, you get this crazy picture of a schoolgirl type posing on a completely boxy looking sports car. Now, it's not clear to me who Seedream are or what they did. Game Developer Research Institute has attached the name Soft Machine to this game. Perhaps the only game developer named after a William Burroughs novel. So it's really hard to say who did exactly what. Still, it's a surprisingly good pinball game, and one I found actually more fun than the Mark Flint Moonball game. Many of you will undoubtedly recognize this title screen as belonging to Xexyz, or more precisely, Ancient Xexyz Vanished, the first game in Falcom's cultish series of action RPGs. I'll admit the title screen looks kinda goofy here, sort of poorly drawn compared to some of the other versions. Well, the Famicom Xexyz never came out in the West, so we're looking at an unofficial translation from David Mullen. Xexyz, by the way, is the name of a legendary city that vanished into the ocean, sort of the Atlantis of Brittany. I thought I read somewhere that game designers claim not to have been inspired by the story of Xexyz, and that the video game story about a mythical civilization called Xexyz is just some sort of weird coincidence. The game actually just plops you down in the middle of town with no backstory. You follow the usual procedure of talking to everyone until you come across the fortune teller who gives you your quest information. Now, conveniently, the game starts you off with 1,000 gold, which sounds great, but the cheapest weapon here costs 500 gold. I guess the world of Xexyz has suffered some sort of severe inflation in comparison to Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. There's also some subquests. For example, talking to the guys in the tavern will fill you in on a missing ring. Probably the first thing to do is try to scrape up enough gold to buy some decent equipment. So you'll need to kill some monsters, but for God's sake, don't forget to equip everything. This is done, sort of counterintuitively, by going into the proper option in the menu and hitting down on the D-pad. A little box will appear around the weapon. I don't know why you don't equip it by hitting one of the buttons like every other RPG ever, but there you go. Now, as mentioned, Xexyz is an action RPG. You attack by running into monsters, though it's best to do so from the side or the rear. If you do hit one from the front, you want to do so with your character slightly off center rather than head on. This will help you avoid damage. But here's the great thing, unlike say Sylviana, your health recharges while standing still in the sunlight. There's no inns or anything like that in the game. On the negative side, you start off very weak, and you see the experience meter? Yeah, you need to get 100 experience points to reach level 2, and your first guys, the enemies you fight, drop like 2 experience each. So yeah, the game is kinda grindy. Now, the thing about the first Xexyz game is that it's been released and re-released probably more times than just about any other video game ever, except for maybe Pac-Man or something like that. The game has also been expanded and changed quite a bit over the years. So I guess settle down for a second, because we're going to go through a virtually definitive tour of the many versions of this game. Ancient Xexyz Vanished was first released by Falcom for the NEC PC-88 in June 1987. This version became sort of the standard template for the game. For a PC-88 game, the graphics are pretty decent, and most notably, the music was very darn catchy. Now, immediately afterwards, a version for the Sharp X1 computer was released, which is almost completely identical. And then a couple months later, it reached the FM7 and the FM77. Again, looks just about the same. It also came out for the PC-98, but that one looks just like the PC-88 version. Now things sort of change a bit. In December 1987, a version for the MSX2 came out. This was the first release that actually changed up the graphics a bit. Like the portrait graphics that appeared when you talk to someone were all redone. But it did suffer from sort of like weird MSX scrolling and movement. After this was a Famicom version we're playing today, and then in October 1988, Sega released this one, a port for the Sega Master System. Again with altered graphics and completely different character portraits. and some of the game layout was changed a bit as well. This version even came out in the United States. Surprisingly, an English version for DOS also emerged in 1988, once again with completely reworked graphics and really bad sound. Now all these were pretty similar in presentation for the most part. The huge step forward came in 1988, when Alpha System developed Ys Books 1 and 2 for the PC Engine and TurboGrafx CD. Now this was a brand new intro, there's more in-game story, there's all these fancy cutscenes, some voice acting was used. Maybe the hugest upgrade was in the music, and the fact that it combined both Ys and its sequel, Ys 2, into one game. So this is, I'd say, is in many ways the definitive version of the game. Again, all the in-game portraits have been changed. And of course, as we know, this one came out in English as well. Still, despite this being so good, newer versions did eventually appear. Ys went high-res in 1991, when it was released for the Sharp 68000 computer. And I'll admit, I don't like the graphics, and the character portraits are absolutely terrifying. And again, the big chunks of the game were changed around quite a bit. And then another pretty substantial reworking occurred for the Sega Saturn on the Falcom Classics discs. Oddly, that chick on the title screen looks a bit sexier now. Once again, the graphics were completely changed, but the music doesn't seem that impressive. Now all this is well and good, but I'd say that far and away the best version out there, other than maybe the PC Engine one, is the Ys Complete. Once again, it has new graphics, good music, more story, content, cutscenes, animated intro. Very nice looking game. This is for Windows. Bosses have been changed. Very cool and beautiful 2D sprite work. It was never released outside of Japan, but an excellent unofficial English patch does exist. And after this, Falcom never stopped. This later came out for the PlayStation 2 in Japan, and more recently it reached cell phones and the DS, though the DS version was, from what I understand, considered somewhat flawed. And there's even probably a few that I missed. There have probably been more ports and re-releases of Ys than have been actual sequels. Well, speaking of flawed, the Famicom version isn't really that hot. It was ported by Advanced Communication, same guys who did Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, so it's not surprising your character moves sort of stiffly, often had difficulty correctly entering doors, he doesn't want to line up correctly. Your character moves slowly in all the earlier versions, but he seems to deal less damage and take more damage than some of the computer versions, making leveling up take much longer. As much as I like Ys, I don't really care for this particular version, so we'll save a more thorough discussion until we happen to reach it in Chrontendo. We have here a new Hudson soft game. It's been a while since we've seen a new Famicom game from them. Kame no Onga Eshe, Urashima Densetsu, which means something like Turtle's Gratitude, Legend of Urashima. The opening sequence shows Urashima rescuing said turtle, who I guess shows his gratitude by giving him a spacesuit and sending him on some kind of galactic rescue mission. So who's this Urashima guy and what's with the turtles? Well, Urashima Taro is a figure from Japanese folklore. Suffice to say that he rescued a turtle and got to go underwater and meet the sea princess and that sort of thing. Obviously, the name Urashima and the opening sequence were stripped from the US release, and the title was changed to the nonsensical sounding Xexyz. Just a wild guess on the pronunciation there. Still, there's a turtle in the title sequence, and the game itself seems to be about the same, still full of seafood monsters and fairies. So anyway, Xexyz starts out rather dickishly by dropping enemies directly on top of you. If you're a Xexyz neophyte like me, you'll probably lose half your life bar trying to get out of these guys' ways and shoot them. Xexyz also has a hell of a lot of doors to enter. Within the first few minutes, you get some plot info, weapons upgrades, new weapons, item shop, a mini-boss, and so on. Thus you spend more time on the first level entering the various rooms than you do actually, shooting enemies and platforming the main level. If this seems just a little out of whack, well, I guess almost everything in this game feels a little off. Now, do those weird half-arched doors remind you of anything? Maybe the very similar doors in Bayou Senshi Dan? Well, it turns out that Hudson hired Atlas to work on this, and this does seem pretty reminiscent of their earlier game. They also shoehorned in some weak shoot-'em-up segments, in which I countered some rather suspicious deaths. Watch this. Wait, what killed me? Let's see it again in slow-mo. No enemy projectiles. Somehow I passed through the platform and then blam. Normally you can touch the platforms, but I guess at the edge of the screen, they suddenly become deadly. Seems like a programming bug to me. At the end of each two-part level, you hop on a flying saucer and fight a gigantic boss, which generally look pretty cool. After defeating these guys, a princess will thank you, offer you a weird sea creature vehicle to ride on, and then you'll fly off to the next island. But first there's another shoot-up sequence, you face another boss, and then you land on the island to start the next level. This game can be visually creative at times. Like here, for example, you rescue a princess from a mini-boss who has seemingly froze her in her bathtub. After defeating the mini-boss, she then thaws out, even wearing a shower cap. So in strictly visual terms, Xexyz rates pretty highly. Each level, at least the outside parts, has its own unique look and feel. The indoors parts seem a bit more similar, but there's still lots of different enemy types. Yet to me, the game just doesn't feel quite right. Your jump is pretty weird and hard to get used to. It makes certain platforming sections pretty damned irritating. Enemies are often hard to hit and can take too many hits to kill. If you die, you start off at the very beginning of the level with a crappy weapon, and you have to find an item shop and then buy a better weapon. The same sort of problems are actually true with the shoot-'em-up parts. You have speed up and power up capsules, but even powered up, your ship is still super lame and boring. And it's just too damned hard to kill the enemies coming at you. Like here, I'm shooting, why doesn't anybody die? All in all, the game started to feel pretty tedious pretty quickly. A shame, because with a bit of work, this could have been really good. I'm going to classify this as a near miss. Oh boy, if you thought Konamic Tennis was less than thrilling, how about Super Dyna'mix Badminton? And why is there an apostrophe in Dyna'mix? That's supposed to indicate a missing letter. Here it's just randomly inserted between two syllables, unless it means we're supposed to pronounce the name Super Dyna'mix. Well, as you see, the game was published by VAP, the guys behind Super Monkey Daiboken, so this is not promising. And you choose between coat 1 through 4. This changes the background, so let's assume they mean court instead of coat. Now here's the funny thing, you can choose between a boy or girl as your player. The cover art even shows a cute blonde girl whose skirt is being lifted up exposing her backside, so you might think that VAP is going for like a sex appeal angle here. But nope, no one even bothered to draw a female sprite. You have the exact same character for either sex. The only difference is the game length. Now this was developed by Paxofnica, whose other credits include working on Nintendo's Ice Hockey. Apparently they didn't learn how to design a good sports game, since Super Dyna'mix Badminton is pretty dire. Even more so than most tennis games, you have to completely ignore the ball, or shuttlecock in this case, and focus entirely on the shadow. You have no way of knowing if you're going to hit the shuttlecock if you don't look at the shadow instead. And then even then, hitting it is tricky. You need to be really close to the shuttlecock in order to hit it. In fact, if you look at the demo, it appears they're hitting the shuttlecock once it's actually behind their backs. I'm sure that with some practice you could overcome the game's peculiarities and master it, but unless you're some sort of huge badminton fan, you're better off playing something like Super Dodgeball instead. Well, SNK shows up again with Famicom Meijinsen, which is a shogi game and has a pretty decent title screen. Meijinsen, by the way, is a pro shogi tournament. Now, I don't know who developed this, since programming the AI on something like this is a little different than what's usually required for most video games. Certain developers tend to specialize in the arcane knowledge required to make a good chess or a good shogi game. So maybe SNK brought in outside assistance for this. You have all the usual options: 1-player, 2-player, tournament. You can watch the Famicom play itself, you can choose among several different players, and there are some instructional scenarios to improve your skills, supposedly. But you know, just like Mahjong, I don't play shogi myself, and I have no way of judging the quality of the game other than on completely superficial criteria. Shogi, as you may recall, is a distant cousin of chess, and plays somewhat the same as chess does, only the pieces tend to move quite a bit differently. If anyone out there is actually a decent shogi player, hey, then give this game a try and leave your thoughts in the comments on the Chrontendo blog. Alright, we have the first of 3 Pony Canyon games today. Matou no Houkai, Hero of Babel, which might be translated as Collapse of the Demon Tower. This one was never released in the US, for good reason, as we'll see, but note the developer's name right there on the title screen, Carrylab. Semi-obscure Japanese software company. We've actually seen one of their earlier games already, Mystery Quest, one of the more blatantly Mario-inspired games for the Famicom. It wasn't a terrible little game, just not very original. So how does Matou no Houkai hold up? Well, it sort of fails in the originality department. It seems to be inspired a little, well no, make that a lot, by Castlevania 2. The tower looks very similar to the castles from that Konami game, and the similarity actually goes a bit further than that, I'm afraid. And maybe there's also a bit of Zelda thrown in. Notice that you have experience points. Every 100 points or so you gain a level and your life bar goes up. Now here's where we sort of come to the first sign of trouble. We're like maybe a minute into the game, and you need a key to leave the first area. In order to get the key, you need to find the, wait for it, the holy water, which is available inside that very first room we come across. But you can't get the holy water until you have 50 experience points. In other words, first thing in the game, we need to start grinding. This would go by much faster if those little blue blobs actually respawned more frequently. Okay, so we got 50 experience points, we'll go in and get the holy water, which is used to put out the torches. Yes, unlike Castlevania, you can't destroy the torches with your regular weapon, you have to throw holy water at them. WP is consumed when you use the holy water or other special weapons, so it's just like the hearts in Castlevania. A lot of times the torches will actually drop WP refills as well. This game has the annoying habit of making enemies sort of materialize right where you're standing, or even dropping them on you from the ceiling. In other words, take a lot of really cheap hits in this game. Now I should point out these levels look bigger than they really are. The screen wraps around from left to right, so when you see what looks like multiple doors on one particular level, that's really just the same door. The levels are very small, horizontally speaking. And for the record, how can a chest drop out of a torch? I assume that was laziness on the developer's part. They just didn't want to draw unique sprites for each item you pick up, so there's just a generic chest sprite instead. You frequently get luck increases in the game. I have no idea how the game mechanics actually work, but the game gives you a very high luck stat. Not that it seems to have any effect on combat. So here's the first boss, and wow. But this fight is actually much more awkward than fighting death in Castlevania. He flies around the ceiling a lot, but occasionally he'll materialize down where you can actually reach him, but you move so slowly that he's usually gone by the time you get to the other side of the room. I think the only way to kill him is either by luck or memorizing where he's going to appear, and then start walking there early, so you can be standing right next to him when he materializes. So that's Matou no Houkai in a nutshell, a lame Castlevania ripoff that manages to make your character way stiffer and slower than even Simon Belmont. Whoa, they just sorta ripped off the bass line from Sunshine Your Love there in the first couple seconds of that musical theme. Kick and Run for the FDS from Taito. Whoopee. In past episodes I've complained about Taito's lack of interest in creating any good original console games. And that really isn't going to be remedied today. Kick and Run is once again an arcade port of a not too terribly exciting soccer game. You have your usual options. You pick a country, game style, number of players. You only have 2 game types. Tournament or a kicking practice. You get a little animation of the players running out on the field, and there you go. Now, the original arcade game was already 2 years old, and really isn't in the same class as something like Rainbow Islands or even Warden no Mori, in terms of memorability. It's really just a plain old soccer game with cute graphics. One nice touch is the way the players react after a goal. The goalkeeper will pound his fist on the ground or kick the goalposts. This game actually plays a lot like Soccer League Winners' Cup. That was the Data East game we saw last episode. Hell, after playing this, I might even be tempted to call Winners' Cup a kick and run clone. All in all, Kick and Run is just sort of handles better than Winners' Cup. It's really not that bad. I suppose it's a decent, no-frills soccer game. Okay, this next one's sort of weird. It's Maniac Mansion from Jalico, based, of course, on the Lucasfilm's groundbreaking 1987 computer game. The game that was first in the run of a series of really great point-and-click adventure games from that particular company. You start, as always, by choosing your characters. Guess these 3 are as good as any. And after this we have the standard animated intro of the meteor crashing outside the mansion, and then the music starts up. And then it gives you the original game's credits. Then we get a scrolling title screen that ironically shows the chainsaw being used. Ironic because the chainsaw is only in the game to tempt you, it can't actually be used. So, anyway, you say, well, there's nothing weird about Maniac Mansion. I played this game on the NES all the time when I was a kid. Yeah, but the odd thing is, the Japanese Maniac Mansion is completely different than the one that was released in the US. Here's the version that everybody knows and loves. This was done by LucasArts and Real-Time Associates in 1990. The graphics and music are all completely different from the Japanese release. Now we have the Japanese version again. So, Maniac Mansion was ported for the system twice, each version completely independent of the other. Something that doesn't happen very often. The Japanese version seems pretty faithful to the original, seen here as the DOS version. You use the words in the menu to build commands. For example, clicking on Use and then Key and then Door will unlock the door. Now for the Japanese game, some graphical changes have occurred. Rooms, such as the kitchen, that take up several screens, in the original game are now only one screen in size. Maybe the Japanese don't like scrolling in their adventure games, or maybe it was just easier to make. The commands have been simplified a bit, from 15 to 12. You have open, push, pull, go, friends, meaning, new kid, close, use, read, give, or transfer maybe, take, turn on, and turn off. In some ways, it's actually more faithful to the original than the American NES game. The statue, which Nintendo of America didn't like, was removed for the US version, and here it's still in the game. So this is not terrible by any means, though the characters all look sort of the same. They lack the individuality found in the American versions. It's still an interesting side note to the Maniac Mansion story. Konami game numero tres. How do they keep pumping these things out? I don't know, but here's another Konamic sports game, Konamic Sports in Seoul. This game was clearly designed to coincide with 1988's Olympic Games. I bet you didn't know Konami had their own airline, now did you? It starts off with the typical Konami animated intro, including an excruciatingly long march. This thing just goes on forever. Now in the US, this was not released until next year, well after the Olympics. Konami ended up releasing it as Track and Field 2, which makes sense since the US version of the first game was called Track and Field instead of Hyper Olympic, as it was called in Japan. There's a couple different modes, but the game really works much like the first Track and Field, meaning there's going to be a lot of button mashing. Everything, however, has been graphically overhauled with more modern-looking, bigger characters. We'll just go ahead and run through the events here. Fencing is sort of a very simple fighting game. You can block and attack high, low, or middle. What you're trying to do here is hit your opponent 5 times in order to win. Of course, without him hitting you first. The diving game is really simple. You just jump off, hit left or right on the D-pad while hitting a button, and you'll do some spins and jackknives. It's actually pretty hard to lose, but it's a bit trickier to get a good score. I believe when you land in the water you have to be as straight as possible, so it's a matter of timing. The shooting game is a bit more difficult, especially when the clay pigeons are fired at extreme angles towards the left or the right. You won't always have time to get your crosshairs over to the side in order to get in a good shot. Still, with practice and some luck, it's really not that tough to qualify. Taekwondo is, once again, sort of a fighting game. You can duck, jump, punch, and kick. Playing against the CPU, however, it's pretty darn easy. You just sort of spam them with kicks, and eventually you'll win. Pole vault is, in the grand track and field tradition, a button masher. Press the A button as fast as you can to build up speed, and then B twice to perform the pole vault. If you can run fast enough, this is incredibly easy to qualify. The canoe event probably has the controls that are hardest to get used to. All you really have to do is navigate your canoe through a series of gates within a certain time, including some gates where you have to pass through going backwards or loop around and go through the other direction. The controls work a little differently than you might think, but once you get used to them, it's actually pretty easy. Archery is pretty cool. You have to adjust the angle of your bow, both up and down and left or right, based on things like wind direction and wind speed, as well as the distance to the target. Then button mash, fill up your power meter, and go. This is the hurdles event. The competitors look like women in this one. Again, it's just straight button mashing with time jumping. Now, this is one of my least favorites. Like diving, you need to execute a series of tricks using button presses, though the score you get seems sort of arbitrary. I got low scores a few times, and then suddenly got a higher score the very last time. No idea why. Triple jump. This is the same guy from the pole vaulting game. It's just like triple jump from the first track and field. It requires some button mashing to build up speed and then a few timed button presses to do the jumps. The key is to get going really fast, and when you jump, don't do it at too high an angle. Otherwise, you just won't get enough horizontal movement. Now this is my least favorite right here, the hammer throw. To build up power, you need to quickly press on the D-pad while rotating in a counterclockwise direction. In other words, you're rubbing your thumb really fast in circles on the D-pad. The friction will cause your thumb to heat up quite a bit, so this game is definitely the most uncomfortable on the hands. And finally, swimming. This is another button masher, only it's A and B alternately this time. There's also a 2-player only arm wrestling game, which isn't an Olympic sport as far as I know. Well, there you have it, Track and Field 2. Really just like the first Track and Field, only with fresher graphics and some new events. We are approaching the end of today's episode, but we still have 2 more Pony Canyon games. First one is Reijin Doshi. Not quite sure how to translate the title, but as you can see here, the game involves Jianshi, Chinese hopping vampires. Also take a look for the Paragon Films credit on the title screen. Now for some odd reason, this actually got a US release under the name Phantom Fighter. Though I really don't think it made much of an impression over here. I've never even heard of it until I did this episode. Kionchi, by the way, is the Japanese name for a jianshi. You have a main town area, which has many doors. Each will lead you inside a building and will usually contain a vampire. Before you enter the room, you actually do have the option of getting a little message that tells you what's inside. The game then becomes a mini fighting game. Granted, a very slow-paced one. Your character is very weak at the beginning of the game, and is virtually evenly matched with the vampires. After defeating a vampire, he'll burst into flame, and in the case of this building, the temple, where we are here, your health will be refilled. You'll need to return to the temple frequently to refill your health meter. In fact, this is the only place where you can refill your health meter. And unfortunately, you can't just leave a room, you have to talk to your assistant and choose the leave option out of the little menu. And this gets aggravating real fast. So does having to walk all the way back to the temple every time you want to refill your health. Now the last vampire game we saw, Xexyz 2, was based on a low-budget vampire movie. But it turns out that Reigendoshi is the official game adaptation of the greatest Chinese vampire movie ever, Mr. Vampire, which was titled Reigendoshi in Japan. This 1985 movie kicked off the whole action horror comedy genre in Hong Kong, and made a star out of Lam Ching-ying, who plays the spirit-busting priest. Your character in the game is based on Lam. The game's opening animation is even taken directly from the movie. There's a scene when the vampire bursts out of his coffin. Now don't be confused by the very similarly titled Reigendoshi, an arcade game, which is copyrighted in 1988 as well. This oddball game was apparently the first fighting game to use digitized graphics, and it does have a jianshi theme, but is really completely unrelated, at least officially, to the Famicom game. Phantom Fighter as a game can't really even come close to being awesome as Mr. Vampire is as a movie, but it's not really terrible. The game is pretty simple and straightforward. Enter each doorway on the street, fight vampires, and pick up an ancient scroll afterwards. Some rooms will require you to fight multiple vampires in a row, and your reward will be these red jewels. Once you have all 3 red jewels, you can then head to the cave at the end of the street and fight a special boss vampire. You then move on to the next town. So what are the ancient scrolls for? Well, they actually serve as a form of currency in the training halls. Use them to buy improved combat techniques, such as double punches and kicks and things like the wolf move, which is just an increase in speed. So the game resembles something like Double Dragon, where you gradually improve on your combat as the game progresses. Oh yeah, and you actually have to answer some goofy trivia questions in order to enter the training hall. So again, Phantom Fighter is a decent, if not exactly thrilling game. Like several other Pony Canyon games, Dr. Chaos being one, it was developed by Marionette and SRS. According to the Game Developer Research Institute, Seishi Yokota from SRS designed the graphics of both this and Dr. Chaos, and they do actually have sort of a similar feel. While this doesn't exactly follow the plot of the movie Mr. Vampire, your character is recognizable as Lam Ying-ching's Taoist priest, and even the movie's subplot concerning a succubus-like ghost finds its way into the game. We've certainly seen worse games based on movies. It's interesting how so many seemingly obscure Japanese releases this episode are either available as official Western releases or have English translation patches. That's the case with this game right here, Kujaku Ou, or Peacock King. Never released outside of Japan, we do have a translation, courtesy of Snark. So the temple being struck by lightning was no coincidence, but indicative of some sort of evil supernatural forces. You, Peacock, are sent out to investigate. You naturally hit the beach and start looking around. That's the first thing you always do when investigating some sort of supernatural activity, right? You head to the beach. Now, Kujaku Ou is clearly a standard Portopia-style adventure game, but it does actually throw in some rather hastily conceived RPG elements, namely the turn-based combat. In certain areas you'll encounter a monster. Most of these encounters are unavoidable battles at certain set places, but I guess sometimes enemies appear sort of randomly in certain areas. Just like Tombs and Treasures from last episode, combat's pretty darn simple, and normally just consists of hitting the fight button over and over again, except for certain boss-like enemies. You do actually have hit points and magic points, or C points as the game calls them, but the game doesn't even bother to display them on the battle screen. Mostly though, you just spend time looking around until something appears, talking to people, which opens up new dialogue options and areas, and then moving on to new areas and so on. The first guy you meet will tell you about the mayor, and the mayor will tell you about the morgue, and then you'll find a large suspicious fish scale on the body, that sort of thing. The fact that the game sort of casually throws around lots and lots of names and places in the opening act might make you think it was based on an existing work, which is correct. Kujaku Ou was a manga series, which was made into 2 movies in 1988. The first was this typical anime deal, sometimes known also as Spirit Warrior. Much more surprising was the live-action film, a Japanese-Hong Kong co-production that starred none other than kung fu movie star Yuen Bio, an associate of Sammo Hung, who even had an appearance in Mr. Vampire. On a side note, Peacock King was directed by Lam Nai Choi, who later made an extremely infamous movie called The Story of Ricky. You might recognize this particular scene here. This was incidentally also based on manga. And of course, there were also some more video games. Kujaku Ou for the MSX was released almost simultaneously with the Famicom game, and it appears to be exactly the same game. Even the graphics are almost identical. On the other hand, we have the Sega Master System Kujaku Ou, released about a month later by Sega. This one actually came out in the US as Spellcaster. The intro makes it look like we're going to be playing the exact same game, but it turns out to be an action game instead. And there were also some sequels a little later. So going back to fighting the topless demons, I guess the game tries to recreate some of the horrific aspects of the comic, which is full of all kinds of icky demons. Maybe the game gets more interesting later. I mean, granted it does have things like flesh-eating mermaids, but for the most part it seems pretty darn tame. And the game does suffer from an overall sort of low-budget vibe. So anyway, after the game's first act, we get sort of this Final Fantasy-style delayed intro, which features all this really ugly and indecipherable imagery. Maybe this would make sense to fans of the comic, but to me it just looks like a bunch of ugly graphics. As mentioned, the adventure game elements are pretty basic. You just sort of look, talk, and move for the most part. It's not always clear what to do, but this is more due to general bad design, rather than any sort of puzzles which are difficult to solve. If you reach a dead end, you generally need to go back and talk to someone again. The RPG-like battle system is also very simple. People complain nowadays about stuff like Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, that they dumb down RPGs for Western audiences, but Japan got lots and lots of this kind of stuff as well. There aren't any healing items or experience points or anything like that. Your health is replenished and you level up at set points in the game. And while it's possible to die, your strategy is simply to use the fight option against regular enemies and pray, that is, use magic, against boss-like enemies. What praying actually does is summon some sort of godlike being to perform a powerful attack, but there's no on-screen representation of this. The text just tells you that so-and-so unleashed a powerful bolt of lightning or something like that. Don't expect any fancy-schmancy summoning animations. It is cool to be able to play this wacky little game in English. It's not exactly good or fun, but exists as a fine example of an unusual middle-grade Japanese licensed game. Okay, the next video coming up will be a new Chrontendo, covering a good chunk of 1988 on the Sega Master System. But then, Chrontendo 36 is the big one, featuring a title that is considered to be perhaps the pinnacle of 8-bit gaming. I, for one, am looking forward to that. See you next time.